How I got started in philanthropy. I married the boss's daughter. And let me amplify that. Uh, I I guess I'd graduated barely from Dartmouth College, and then from that with an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And then I spent a little time working on Wall Street for specialists on the New York Stock Exchange. And then I was, after a little volunteer duty in the Army, and then I worked for a management consulting firm for about 10 years. And my father-in-law, who was Harding Mott, who was then president of the Mott Foundation, and obviously his father was Charles Stewart Mott, who founded the foundation. And so he asked me to come out and help him. That's how I got started in late 1968 as a consultant. I once ran a youth recreation center when I was in high school because they were trying to keep me out of trouble. And that's what they did. But I'll elaborate a little more how I got started, because I'm going to answer a question you probably won't ask. And I noticed, I've got to read and put on my glasses. And you say, truly, Michigan is a state of generosity. Over the past 40 years, Michigan's philanthropic leaders have developed an integrated framework to support the nonprofit sector across both a statewide geography and over time. How was such a dynamic powerhouse of philanthropic giving, volunteer human capital, and nonprofit management training created? Can the lessons be replicated? So, when I first read that, I said to myself, you need to start before 40 years ago. You need to go back, let's say, almost to the founding of the state of Michigan. Or, for purposes of my story, which is the only story I really know, is that C.S. Mott, the founder of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, was born in 1875. And he died in 1973. And some people said he was the second century man. Think about it, 1875. That's the second century of the United States. And as far as some people talk about recently, the American century was coming up. It was a short century with a couple of world wars in there. But anyway, C.S. Mott came out to Michigan in the early 1900s. We're saying maybe about 1903 in that period or earlier, and sold Ransom Olds an order for 500 axles. And then, as he told me, he said, I had never made an automobile axle. So I went home, because he was a bicycle manufacturer, pipe your pedal. And he said, I went home and sweated blood. But he said, I built an unbreakable axle. And that led, of course, to his company becoming the largest axle manufacturer in the world. And then he was invited by Billy Durant, who was the founder of General Motors, and it had been founded in Flint. It hadn't been founded yet, but he was invited by Billy Durant, who was running the Buick Motor Car Company at that time, or owned it, to come to Flint, Michigan. He did. And then later, I'm jumping forward now, after merging his company into General Motors over a course of a couple of years for stock in General Motors, he then went on the board of the General Motors Corporation in 1913 and stayed on the board until his death in 1973. And so he was, at one time, he was the chief of staff of General Motors, which would be the chief operating person. And, but the key story here is he was a very successful industrialist. He was also a banker. He owned utilities. He did all sorts of stuff. He was a true entrepreneur. Maybe he was a real venture capitalist. I don't know. But this little town he came to, called Flint, Michigan, had about 13,000 people in 1900. And by 1920, it had about 100,000 people. So in that period, he ran for mayor, and he was mayor. And I believe it's 1912 and 1913, and then a third term in 1918. And why mayor? Because he knew that the infrastructure, we talk about infrastructure today, was built for 13,000 and couldn't support the people that were coming here for jobs. And so as a result, they had to build houses, roads, sewers, school systems. So that was some government service. He did run for governor, but was not elected. The other thing that occurred is that if you look at the history of all the major social service, charitable organizations in town, you'll find out that he was one of the founders. He was there because the infrastructure that existed for 13,000 people, don't forget, this town had been through fur trading, to lumbering, to carriages, and now automobiles. So anyway, the thing is, he was a major volunteer. He realized that the whole nonprofit, what we call nonprofit sector, social service sector, that health, education, everything was absolutely essential. And he did all this. And we didn't talk about it per se, but he founded the foundation about 1926. And if you think about what was happening, I think, I don't have the exact dates, but I think Kresge was formed in the 1924. I think Kellogg was 30s, I think. Ford was also in that period, and just go down the list. And so what I'm trying to say is you cannot separate our generosity or divorce it from the donors. And Michigan was a very dynamic place. and it didn't have the natural abilities. The entire automobile industry should have been, as he said, in the East Coast. But they didn't have the entrepreneurial spirit, the creativity, and the big word, you know what I mean, to do it. And in Michigan, there were a bunch of sodbusters, as he used to put it. And when now we get into the agriculture, we had a lot of things happening in that period. And I believe probably if you go through every Michigan town, you'll find another Mr. Mott who made their fortune in agriculture or made it in products that came off the farm or retail or something else or automobiles. And that is unique, I think, because all these communities were growing fast and services had to be provided. So I think it became ingrained in just the culture of the state. And I'm not from Michigan, to help others because they had to in those early days. And so it was just the right thing to do. No one told him at age 78 or whatever age it was to go out and climb a ladder and start hammering shingles back on a house when the tornado came through. It was ingrained in the nature of many of these founders and donors that we talk about today. Okay, I'll go all over the world and then I'll come back.
Okay, that's a deal.
Because the story also begins before 1975. Let me real fast, and then we'll come back on that. And then I'll go all over the world. When I came out here, I said it was late 1968 as a consultant. And I watched Mr. Mott prepare his voluntary, I might add, testimony to the House Ways and Means Committee at hearings, which led to the famous, infamous, or whatever you wish to call it, the Tax Reform Act of 1969. And I would say this whole state of generosity project begins with that Tax Reform Act. And as I watched and as I listened to what occurred, the field didn't know how to handle. They were unprepared, totally. No one really knew anybody. And it was obvious that some of the top names in the philanthropic sector couldn't speak for the whole sector because they didn't know each other. So anyway, that occurred. And that, to me, was one of just the key takeaways. And really, all we had in those days, or the sector had, was a new Council on Foundations, which community foundations and some others had joined together on, and the Foundation Library Center. There wasn't much else. No data. No, the Foundation Library Center had some, but not data analyzing the operations. Okay, I remember next, and I don't remember the date or the convener, going to a meeting at Meadowbrook Hall. And I think there are about 11 or 13 people there. From our place, I think we had our financial vice president, Bob McCullough. I think we had Harding Mott, who was then president of the foundation, myself. And I'm trying to think who the third person was. I think it was Frank Manley, our long-term executive director. And there were about 13 other people. I might have been Ted Baldwin, not Ted Baldwin, Bill Baldwin of the Kresge Foundation might have been the one. He was chairman, might have of their place, might have called it. I don't know, and I can't remember who was there. People from Kellogg were there, and some others. My takeaway from that meeting, a nice, polite little luncheon with 13 people, we really didn't know each other. We didn't know. So we, well. Then I jumped forward. And then there were some informal meetings that I can't remember for a couple of years. I think Russ Mobby at Kellogg had brought them together, the group, and informal meetings of what became the Council of Michigan Foundations. Then I remember, I guess it was the first meeting in 1975 or someplace there of the Council on Foundations. And to me, probably the most arresting, which gets to your question, which I've been avoiding, the most arresting platform speaker I have ever heard was former Congresswoman and former Lieutenant Governor later in life, Martha Griffiths. And she was on the House Ways and Means Committee, I think fourth ranking member, when the Tax Reform Act of 1969 was passed. And I forget who put the question to her. Maybe it was Dottie Johnson. And the question was, Congresswoman, was it the intent of Congress in 1969 when they passed the Foundation Tax Reform Act to put foundations out of business? Yes. But she says, I need to say that is no longer our feeling. Oh, thank you very much, I thought to myself. And I would say that gave an impetus to everything in the next few years that the Council of Michigan Foundations did. It was just really good. And I think Leonard White was the first chair and just did a marvelous job. Excuse me. One of the things I remember the council doing, one of the first tasks was create a legislative agenda. After all, at that time, the excise tax, I believe, was 4%. Since it's been lowered to 2%, obviously we'd like something different. And it was, the payout rate was a fluctuating rate. And at that time, at least at the Mott Foundation, we were invested because it was a high yield period and we had a lot of bonds. We were invested to earn over 7%, and we were having to spend 7%, 5% or 7%. It was a fluctuating rate, and it was just killing us. We couldn't stay in business. And so the Council of Michigan Foundations, under Dottie Johnson's wonderful leadership, started this legislative agenda. Now we jump forward a little bit. And I'm sitting upstairs in my office, And my father-in-law, Harding Mott, we had open offices then. We'd torn down the walls, etc. And so he yells, "Bill, come over here. I want you to meet somebody." And I yell back, "I'm too busy. I can't." He says, "No, you need to come over here." So I come in, sleeves rolled up, tie unloosened, and he says, "I want you to meet Chuck Chamberlain." And Chuck Chamberlain, "Hi, good to meet you, Bill." Blah, 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 blah. And I said, "I'm sorry, I'm just so busy." Well, he says, "Well, if I can ever help you, you just let me know." I said, "Okay." And Harding says, Chuck used to be the congressman from, I think it was the Lansing area, from also knew him very well. And he used to serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and he's now a lawyer uh, working on Capitol Hill. Okay. Well, you said if you can ever do anything for me, I said, "I'll tell you what." I said, "I've just been to a meeting with this group, the Council of Michigan Foundations, and they've come up with this little pamphlet you can stick in your vest pocket. And it was the legislative agenda." I said, "Here, you can really help me. Here's the Council of Michigan Foundation's legislative agenda. If you can get that passed, you'll really help me and everybody else in the state of Michigan." Well, little did I know, I think he lived next door to Dave Durenberger, who was a senator from Minnesota. And there was a nascent council of foundations in Minnesota, and they were after a flat tax. And Durenberger believed in the flat tax. And there was also I forget his name, congressman from there. So the next thing I know, someone has placed the Council of Michigan's Foundation's legislative agenda, I believe, in the entire thing in the congressional record. Yes. So little did I know, and I may have it mixed up, but he also knew Monahan, Senator Monahan from New York. And, well, no, first, I got the story wrong. First, he said, yes, on this 5%, it might be good to have some analysis or something. So our investment office and Bob Sweeney, who was then our chief investment officer, put together their own payout study. This was way before we knew about Cambridge, or Cambridge may not have been there. So he put together this payout study, and believe me, if you knew what he was saying by the time you reached the end, all I remember is the foundations could only afford to pay out 4.2%, but 4.8 you could live with, and that was closer to 5. But we couldn't pay out more than 5%. That was and he had studied the long-term returns, zinc-filled, and I can't remember the details. They do the work still, the firm. And so I gave that to Charles Chamberlain. The next thing I know, he had given it to Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, who had put it into the congressional record. Okay? And then I know in the meantime, and maybe about this time, our financial vice president then, Larry Doyle, and myself, went down to Capitol Hill or to Washington, and we met with the people in the Council on Foundations. And we were complaining about the payout rate. And they said, sort of in effect, "You don't know what you're dealing with. That's very nice, and we're worried about it. But yes, nice of you to come in." and they were good people. But when we walked out the door, we looked at each other and said, let's do it. So we came back, and with Charles' efforts, I remember meeting with he was Republican, all the senators on the Republican side of the aisle on the Senate Finance Committee. And I remember meeting with some of the leaders on the Democratic side. And then we suddenly reached the point where I forget who it was, and Dottie Johnson would remember, but we reached the point where it was Durenberger wanted to put something down and on the 5%. And but they had to know. And so at that point, the Council of Michigan Foundations got involved, and they'd been running around Capitol Hill. And I think Randy Reeker or maybe it was Dottie Johnson, they went and got hold of Bob Griffin, who then was out of office, I believe, but to go in and talk with Dole or whoever was running the Senate those days and say, Durenberger will offer an amendment for a flat 5%, assuming you're willing to take it. And that's how we got the 5%. But the key point is, I remember going around with Dottie, and I forget who else. And at one point, Chuck Chamberlain picked us up, and so we fit in one car, okay? And we're going around to the Michigan delegation, hi, and boom, 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 telling our story back in those early days. And I may have the time sequence a little wrong here. And but we began the tradition way back then of telling the story. And today, that's Foundations on the Hill. And we still regard that as the third commandment. Thou shalt go to the hill once a year and tell your story. And I just wanted to say, sometimes people say, what does a regional association do? Think about it. Every foundation in the country, their payout rate is 5%. I don't know, is that impact investing? That's huge. That's results. That's return on investment. And only a regional, a statewide, or a regional group of grant makers do that. No one else can do it. You can't do it from Washington. Because each regional association has a broad range of members, from the smallest foundations to the largest. But when they come together in common cause, we appreciate each other. I don't care if that foundation only has a few assets and a small single-person grant-giving program, but they may really be delving deeply and have a lifetime commitment to that giving program. They've got good ideas. I can learn from them. And we can learn from each other. And that's our strength. And guess what? Every congressman or congresswoman person and every senator has a foundation that they represent. No other organization has a membership like that. No one can duplicate. And the real thing is, yes, we go to the Capitol Hill, but the main thing is today, every one of us, at least I think in Michigan, we're meeting with our representatives, whether it be in Washington or in Lansing in the State House, telling our story, or we're partnering with them. And that's, if I could get one message across, it began out of that 69 Tax Act in realizing that we needed to do a lot. One, communicate. We needed to communicate with our elected representatives and not view them as an adversary, but as a partner. And we needed to also, we came out of business in industry, as I described with Mr. Mott or Mr. Kellogg or Mr. Kresge. We needed to join together, or Ransom Olds for them. We needed to join with business and partner with them. And since every one of the people I've named has been involved in the social service sector, education, health, the arts, yes, we needed to both personally as well as philanthropically support a strong, strong infrastructure. And I'm sorry I took up so much time going into the period before the 40-year period. But now we're in the 40-year period. And out of that, of course, volunteer centers merged in to become the independent sector. The Filer Commission occurred. The Donors Forum occurred, and that became NCRP. The Foundation Library Center became the Foundation Center, and GuideStar emerged from there. BoardSource emerged, etc. The panel standards begin over this 40-year period, come into place. You have the panel on the nonprofit sector that I know Dottie Johnson was a part of. I was a part of it, and others were a part of it. I think Sam Singh from Michigan was also on it. And so that was critical. And of course, the Council on Michigan Foundations they did have the standards project for community foundations. And of course, in Michigan, we've all really supported community foundations. And of course, we had a little role of that. And I may have skipped some things forward, but I can go back to the international if you want me. Well, start with Mr. Mott. Sweat blood occasionally. Secondly, trust the people in the other organizations. And I think in terms of leadership, you have to learn to become a witness on the sidelines or someone in the stands applauding great work. And so you've got to learn to recognize great work and trust. At times you may want to hit them on the head, and that's fair, but you have to trust them. And I think that's one of the things, and it's trust and respect the opinions of the others. We wouldn't have had a good legislative agenda had it not been Bill Allen talking about using an agricultural term, a parity. And that got into a whole discussion of community foundations versus private foundations, and should they be the same? And that was just one of the things that led us into the whole community foundation field. Not a fight over money, there's plenty of wealth. Get that one behind. The other thing I would say, besides trust and good management principles, and you can't get too carried away with yourself. And there was one other, and I forget the story. I'll come back, but but anyway.
Yeah, because it looked to me like you all had a lot of fun. That you had fun together.
Well, when you're creating something, it is fun, and when you of course, being on a winning team. And we had the great fortune in Michigan of having two great leaders of the Council of Michigan Foundation. Dottie Johnson, who trained, and I had a little bit to do with it because he worked for us, Rob Collier. And we've had a continuity of leadership. And I think continuity of leadership and also a vision, of purpose. And we've had it's not been about person. It's been about let's work together to solve a problem. And philanthropy should be about helping society come together, all parts of society. And after all, as I once told the brand new Polish president when he just had become president of Poland in this first 60 days, there is no separation between a Mr. Mott, who was an elected public official, who was a financier, industrialist, a business person, and a nonprofit person. No, you cannot, Mr. President, separate the sectors. They're all part of each other. And if you don't get that point, you miss it. Need to be together. No, you can't cut Mr. Mott into 3 different pieces. No, that isn't how it works, because all 3 sectors come together one way or another in most people's lives. Well, prior to doing it, we'd had a little planning exercise. I won't go into detail, trying to identify the big issues for facing us. And they were education, they were the environment, values, ethics, and leadership. And the other was, of course, Flint was there. And the other was nuclear war. And we changed, don't forget, in those days, the Soviet Union and the US were locked in a conflict and of ideas. And we changed. We knew we could do nothing in nuclear war, but we need something about building community. And that's what I've been talking about, building community. And that's something I would say to a leadership, a group of students. Yes, it's about building community and successful organizations. But so here we were so we changed it to the pursuit of peace. And the next thing you know, and I had been on a council and foundation trip with a couple of my trustees, incidentally, to Russia. And we just saw it. And about that time, the Soviet Union disintegrated. And it just appeared to me, never in my lifetime that I believe that would occur. I couldn't dream it. And I thought, I don't know what we can do. But I likened it to a grain of sand on a beach or a drop of water in the ocean. It only may be one drop. It may not be very significant. But I want to be one of those drops. I want to be there. This is the greatest things that's occurred in my lifetime almost. So anyway, off I went, and I ran across some people. And in fact, I was sitting in the back of a bus at another time. This was my first time to Poland, and I didn't know where it was even or where it was. And trying to sleep early in the morning on top of a bunch of bags. And this guy, midway up the bus, is talking about the European Foundation Center, how great it was. And he became my fast friend, John Richardson. And so I'm trying to sleep at 7 in the morning, and we've been waiting for an hour for Sylvie Sabula from the Foundation of France to get done with breakfast so we can go to Warsaw. We were down in Krakow. And I finally yelled out, "Shut up, I'll buy it." So that's how John and I met and formed a strong, and he was the executive director. And it was basically, and they never really had a meeting, 7 European foundations coming together to form what became the European Foundation Center. And today it has a couple of hundred members from all over Europe as well as international members. And so, having just been through 69 and the Council of Michigan Foundations and developing an independent sector and helping, I was on one of the early boards of the independent sector. I think I had the privilege of serving under Brian O'Connell, Sarah Melendez, and Diana Aviv. So, I said, this is something we have to back. We want to help the nonprofits, which are beginning to emerge in the former Soviet Union, and they need some place to go. They shouldn't be coming to the US all the time. They're European, and so they should be meeting with Europeans. So we backed the European Foundation Center very strongly, and we still do. And that was in the day the Berlin Wall came down, 1989. So we've been supporting it, and I think we were on until about 2 years ago, their board, from the day it officially organized. And I think we're back on the board now. So anyway, and then there were other organizations coming out of that. So we supported the Wings organization. We supported Civicus. In fact, supported. We were one of 5 people in a room that developed the idea that led to Civicus. And there were other things, the Global Fund for Community Philanthropy. And way back when, the Flint the Flint Public Trust was formed in 1950. We gave a big grant to it then, but it was a dormant community foundation. There were a lot of those in this country, dormant community or cities of significant size that to support a community foundation that didn't have any. So we said, this is a great idea. It's wonderful. Think about it. You create a philanthropic fund in a local region, and then those people not only can dream and vision and plan, but they can have some money and resources to put behind their vision. That's great. That's wonderful. And so we supported first, and Eugene Struckoff had been the former president of the Council on Foundations in Washington, and he became the Johnny Appleseed of community foundations. There were a few others, different approaches, and then there were a bunch of consultants, and the next thing you know, Michael Brophy of the Charities Aid Foundation in the UK had asked us to partner with them. And when we started, there were about a handful of community foundations in the UK. And today, the entire UK is covered by community foundation. And I think the assets are more than $1 billion. And I forget what the level of giving is in the UK. Is Doug Jansen, he used to be, I think, with the Minneapolis and the Rhode Island Community Foundations, both of them. He was a consultant, said it was the greatest story of leverage I have ever seen in the philanthropic world. We put in a few bucks, and we're continuing to support the UK Community Foundation Trade Association, if I may use that word. And then that led into the global community foundations. And I just think people talk about, as I said, impact and results, return, but just think about it. 100 years ago, 102 years ago, or 101 now, Goff in Cleveland developed the first U.S.-based community foundation, the first in 1914. And we just celebrated that 100th anniversary. And today, there are over 1,800, probably closer to 1,840 community foundations worldwide, with more occurring outside the United States. We had helped in Canada. We had helped in, besides the UK, and also in Mexico, and South Africa, Russia, the former Soviet bloc. Germany has a lot, Italy, Netherlands, other places. They are developing because it's a great idea. And I think this story, State of Generosity, it's about good ideas. That's what it's all about, a good idea. You can't keep it down. And that's the story I was going to tell that I forgot. It was my idea. I didn't remember that. Let me just tell my story.
Good.
If I'm teaching a student, everyone's going to walk along the sidewalk with their head in the skies like a peacock, and they can either slip on a banana peel and fall down, or like a peacock with their head pruning their feathers, they're going to get run over by a truck. And the great story is getting yourself up. Getting yourself up and dusting yourself out and continuing. I think Edison did that. And Babe Ruth, you know, he probably struck out more times than he did hit home runs. So great ideas. And it takes a while to implement great ideas, but it requires persistence, the sweating the blood, the hard work. And I would do that. On the Michigan AIDS funds, it was obviously something that was occurring on a nationwide basis. And I know the Ford Foundation had also supported some things, and it seemed the appropriate thing to do here in Michigan. I was not close to that because we had a staff member who, for years, let's go back again. His name was Alon Garanze. He was a wonderful, and he still is a wonderful person. And he worked for Tom Buckman at the old Foundation Library Center. And this European Foundation Center was just being formed in Brussels. And they needed someone with the knowledge like Galan had at the Foundation Library. So he went over to Brussels, and we supported his salary over there for a long time. And then he decided to return to the U.S., and so we hired him as a staff member. And he is openly gay and has been for a long time. And he was our staff member in the AIDS Fund. So that's, I think one of the stories here is, yes, we've been involved with a lot of the activities that occurred in this 40-year period. We funded some of them, and some we were quiet partners. I mean, and in other cases, we had staff members. And so I'm not the right person to ask about it, you know, because we've had people on the board of the Council of Michigan Foundations from Rapley, John Porter, a trustee. I don't know about Ollie Maynard. We also had Phil Peters, Neil Haggerty, Maureen Smith. And so, yeah, you don't build a movement all by yourself. That's another leadership thing. You've got to depend on others. You've got to trust staff. You've got to have good staff. Okay, well, you asked about the Office of Foundation Liaison at the governor's office. And it occurred during the Granholm administration. And I believe some people from other foundations had a great idea. I think it was Dave Egner and the late Dave Campbell, I believe, had a great idea. And that there ought to be someone in the governor's office, in cabinet, really, who knows about foundation but can serve as a liaison between state government and foundations. And it just so happened that we had a staff member who had experience in state government as a budget director, I think, and was looking for a change. And yes, and it fit right in, Karen Aldridge Eason. And so I think Neil Haggerty or Maureen Smith, I'm not sure which, has been, because Maureen has now left us, retired, been the staff, have been on the advisory committee. And it's gone through 2 administrations, this office. And guess what? When we were having some problems in Flint, I didn't know who to call. And I'm going down. Do I call the governor on this? Do I call the budget person? Do I call the environmental protection person? Whoever, who do I call? I'm suddenly thinking, oh, there's Karen Aldridge Eason, the foundation liaison. So I picked up the phone and called her. And she came right back and said, yeah, we're looking at this problem. Thank you. Yes. Well, I don't know where the original idea came from, but Maureen Smith, who ended up being our vice president of programs, was in charge of our environmental program for part of her career here. And the idea, there was a $25,000 grant she gave. And then it was followed up with another several $100,000. And out of that grew the Great Lakes Protection Fund, which is a huge leverage or return on investment, because it continues today. In fact, my son, who is now the 4th president of the Mott Foundation, and one of our program officers, Jomana Vasi, last weekend went to Quebec City and at a conference of the Great Lake governors and the premiers of all the Canadian provinces bordering on the Great Lakes ecosystem. And my son was blown away by the meeting and the conference. And this is about 10 to 15 years after the fund was created. But it's huge. And probably one of the most important things that a lot of foundations and others, and Council of Michigan Foundations was involved in a little bit, in some community foundations were created around the Great Lakes to work in concert on common problems, and like they have on other issues like neighborhood small grants, race, and other issues. But it was a great program. And here it is years later bearing a lot of fruit because it is 20% of the world's fresh water and absolutely essential. Well, as I said earlier, it just is a great idea. The idea of creating a vehicle, an investment vehicle, a giving vehicle in a community which is controlled by community members. It also, I don't care where you are in the world, there is wealth. After all, if you read the Bible, you read about the widow with her two mites, pennies, and how important that was, those two mites were. And so I don't care. It can bring the widow with the two mites. It can bring a bunch of school teachers or students together to honor, let's say, a teacher that they all admired and create a fund in that person's name. That can occur in any community. And as a result, you can create these bodies and places where you can convene. And that is one of the purposes of a community foundation, bringing people together, collecting assets for the benefit of the public and the community, and then figuring out what some good ideas, practical ideas that a community foundation can fund. And one of the nice things about a community foundation, it's not like the Mott Foundation, where we can parachute into, I mentioned Poland, and fund for a while. But then, but they're now part of the European Union. They no longer need our money. Bye-bye. But a community foundation stays in the community. And that to me is that idea Hank Goff had years ago. And it's just a great, great idea. Now, I have learned over the years that if you're going to have a successful operation, I don't care if it's a business operation, I don't care if it's government, and I need to remember to come to NEI, back to NEI and Detroit Institute of Arts. I don't care if it's government, business, or nonprofit, social service. You need a strong back office. You need to be able to keep records. You need to be able to convene people and keep track of what took place. You need to be able to handle the money ethically and efficiently and effectively. You need to be able to do all that. And that's often overlooked in our conversation. You can create a great organization, but you better make sure you have a good board, followed by good leadership. And then you better make sure someone knows how to add up the numbers that are being entered into the code of accounts on the balance sheet or the profit and loss. And I've learned the hard way that you always must pay attention to that. And as a society, we're learning as school districts begin to go into bankruptcy, cities go into bankruptcy. And one of the things I said, remind me of NEI. I think one of the reasons this is the new economy initiative down in Detroit, helping Detroit revitalize itself. And I think one of the reasons that it was possible for that group to come together and do that was that we had all been working together at the Council of Michigan Foundation. It was a spinoff that the council necessarily didn't have to cause, but a lot of the same actors. And the governor at a celebration party about the big bargain that was created to save the Detroit Institute of Arts, their art collection, and protect it forever, hopefully, from bankruptcy. As the governor pointed out, that couldn't have happened had NEI not already been there. And maybe NEI wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the Council of Michigan Foundation. So this idea of understanding you don't have to have the bright idea. And that's also a lesson to teach. You don't, but if someone has a bright idea, and sometimes you need to share that idea with others, as long as you get the job done, it doesn't matter who gets the credit. My son says that all the time. One thing I do want to say, we've had a lot of staff in various parts of it. But the other thing I want to say, if I could get one message across, we need to continue to support, not only in Michigan, every state ought to have a strong association of grant makers. It needs to be there. And it's just fundamental. The other, yes, and we have in the state of Michigan, we're fortunate. In fact, I told Kyle Caldwell, who's coming to, I believe, the Johnson Center, hey, Michigan is, with his going to the Johnson Center, Michigan is back where it belongs. Hello, Dolly, you're back where you belong. Think about it. We have the Council of Michigan Foundation, who I will say is the best. Number two, we have the Michigan Nonprofit Association, and a lot of them, and I would put it right up there at the top as a meeting ground. And a lot of different projects where the Council of Michigan Foundations have been involved, as well as state government. And obviously, state government was involved in helping shape what it is today. And now an academic center that promises to be as good as it gets. I mean, how fortunate are we in the state of Michigan to be able to have three essential prongs? Well, I'm hoping that generation doesn't screw it up. So that's number one. And that generation, I don't know what the problems are going to be because I'm a dinosaur. I don't know what my password is. I don't know how to turn on a computer. I don't use it, period. I don't have a cell phone, really. So I'm a dinosaur from a different age. I don't know what the problems are going to be and what new creative ideas are going to be needed to meet the problems. I mean, after all, Flint was the largest city in the world, I think, at least according to the literature, supporting the development of horse-drawn carriages. Then we had to become a center of the automobile industry. I don't know what the challenges are going forward. I don't know where electronics, social media, and all that is taking us, how it will change us, because we have gone from the agrarian to the Great Lakes to a place. So much of what we've done is about place. all of a sudden the Iron Curtain came down and how can we help them? And now we're saying that the World Bank and the other Bretton Woods institutions may have seen their best days because you now have China growing, developing, creating Asian development banks, or the Bendes Bank down in Brazil and others. And they have more money than the World Bank has. Huge amounts of money. And the Chinese economy is growing. The Indian economy is growing. The world is changing rapidly. And so we have moved, it seems, from a place-based to a global. I don't know. But on the other hand, I sense that many young people today, rather than working for a big corporation or something else, might want to return to place and might want to improve their little corner of the world. It's pretty hard to be Atlas and hold the world up. But you can do something in your own little corner of the world. And so it's up to the next generation to figure out how they're going to address the huge, huge challenges. I think very few people were there when 1969 occurred, and they did not see how it can change your operations. And therefore, they don't put. I was in a small group recently, and to them, a regional association of grant makers wasn't one of the 5 essential infrastructure organization. Yeah. And these are some people who are head of some very large foundation. They don't know or appreciate what an infrastructure. You know, the key to the infrastructure are local people, local organizations coming together. They think it's all about, well, how can we be a little more effective? Or how can we do this or get a little more data? But big data. But sometimes, don't we wish we had some even little data back in 1969? They don't understand or appreciate why the infrastructure we have today seems appropriate. Now, does that? No. There may need to be changes, and there will be changes. And the good thing about the Council of Michigan Foundation is that I think, one, it's rooted in place with a global vision. You've had people from the former Soviet blocs and elsewhere in the world come out to Michigan to study how it's done or visit Michigan community foundations. But it's place-based, it's trust-based, and it's we're in this together, and let's make it work. And as long as we have that fundamental idea and appreciation and trust of others, I think we'll be okay. But I do worry, like everyone, that everyone equates the wealth of Wall Street. And I know C.S. Mott had nothing good to say about Wall Street because, don't forget, he had to help save General Motors in 1920. As Pierre Dupont said, C.S., if it weren't for you, Sloan in New York, you running everything in Detroit, and Bassett, who was the head of Buick, General Motors would not have survived in 1920. So, yeah, we need, and I think, at least in Michigan, we're always going to have some very rooted, practical people who have some good ideas too. And occasionally we'll take time to go out and maybe canoe or kayak or something and smell the water and the trees. I wouldn't say it's been conscious. My father was a very successful newspaper guy. He, for many years, was business and financial editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and he traveled the world for that in that job too. He later became, in our church, which is the Christian Science Church, he became a lecturer and speaker, and my mother also. So they traveled the world in trying to help people. We've been blessed with great people. Think about Ranny Reeker. I mean, just wonderful person. Russ Mobby, Leonard Smith. I mentioned Bill Baldwin. I didn't mention Ted Taylor even. You know, we've had great people, and yes, my current colleagues at other foundations. But I mentioned Egner. Okay, let's just think about just bright people who just keep on every day. Miriam Noland at the Southeastern Community Foundation, who was sort of the den mother who brought everybody together around NEI and the DIA. So we've been blessed. I think it's a state which is large, is blessed with natural resources, has a diversified economy, has diversified political beliefs, and so it's large enough to have impact. And it's got great, and I haven't mentioned them, universities, like where you are, great universities. And, but we're not so big. And I'm a New Yorker to a degree, or lived in Boston, other places like that. But it's Wall Street is all about how do I get into the top percent or tenth of 1%? How do I get to that? It's all about that. It's all about, I don't think this state is about me. I mean, I forget the guy's name, but the one who is trying Quicken Loan person. You know, yeah, I'm sure I've never met him. I'm sure there's some me, but there are people in Detroit and in other cities who are investing their money back into their communities. And that's what C.S. Mott, he wanted to invest back in the people and the place that helped him make a fortune. And he felt indebted to them. And I think that feeling still exists. I know C.S. Mott once in his biography, he said, if I can, I haven't looked at it recently, every person is in an informal, perhaps unconscious relationship with every other person in the quest for civilization. And yes, I think that's embedded in the DNA of the state.